So I've been using the new 15-inch M2 MacBook Air since it came out, and I'm using it every single day as my main computer to really put it through its paces and see if it's a recommendable laptop at the price point, at its size, and making sure that it gets everything done that you would need to in this product category. So I do have some overall thoughts on this MacBook Air. There's a lot of good that's come with it because we've been wanting a larger 15-inch MacBook Air that's lighter, that's cheaper, and not making us go to the MacBook Pro. But there is some bad that I want to reiterate on and make sure that you guys are aware of before purchasing this laptop. So without further ado, let's get into my long-ish term review of the M2 MacBook Air 15-inch edition. Let's get into it. So before I do get started, I want to talk about the actual spec that I got. I wanted to go with the baseline model to make sure that I got the best kind of experience that you would get with the advertised $1299 price. Now, one thing I will say, if you are US based, take advantage of the education pricing. There's no verification, there's no ID that's needed to be proven, and you do get $100 off and then $20 off every added kind of spec update. So you can get this for $11.99 from the education store on the US education website. I don't know what it's like internationally. But again, with that baseline spec, you get 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage as the baseline spec with that M2 chip. And you can spec this up to 2 terabytes of storage if you're willing to pay that premium. It does come in those 4 colorways, so you get that starlight color, you get the classic gray, you get the space gray, and then you do get the midnight blue color, which is the one that I've been really enjoying. And I did mention in my comparison review between the 13 and the 15 that after a while, especially around the USB-C and Thunderbolt ports, you do get a little bit, I guess, of chip paint, if that's even what you can call it, or maybe you see a little bit more of a glimmer there and the paint kind of comes off. That has happened over the year that I've had the 13-inch MacBook Air, but this one, obviously it's brand new, so you don't see any of that, but just keep that in mind that with the darker one, you are probably a little bit more susceptible to seeing that, but it's really not a big deal at all. And then in terms of the differences that you get from this 15-inch MacBook Air to the 13-inch MacBook Air, aside from the size, of course, you're going from 13.6 inches to 15.3 diagonally with this MacBook Air. And in terms of actual internal differences, it doesn't actually change that much, if at all. The only thing that you do get upgraded is you get better speakers. So instead of 4 speakers, you get 6 speakers, and you get force canceling subwoofers. And with this, what I'm about to show you, there is a nice little sound difference with those speakers. And then in terms of size, obviously it's going to be a bigger device. You do gain about 0.6 pounds of weight, so you go from 2.7 to 3.3 pounds compared to the 13-inch. You get about an inch more of depth, an inch more of width, and you do go 2 millimeters thicker with this laptop, which is honestly pretty insane with how much power and how kind of amazing this laptop is. Because from a screen real estate perspective, you do get a much larger screen, but you still keep the same 500 nits, you still keep the same pixel density, you get more pixels obviously, which we'll touch on what that actually gives you from a use case perspective. But overall, I do enjoy this larger screen, the form factor. It's not super heavy at 3.3 pounds, easy to throw around, still very lappable. You can bring it to a coffee shop and everything in between. And that is the point of this 15-inch MacBook Air. It's for those people that want some extra screen real estate, but don't want to spend that $2,000 or $2,500 on a 14 or a 16-inch MacBook Pro because they don't need that power and they don't need that screen. One omission, which I was a little bit surprised about, which is not a huge deal, especially if you don't have the router to support this, is I really thought that the M2 MacBook Air, the 15-inch version, will get the upgraded Wi-Fi 6E, but it still kept the same Wi-Fi 6 module from the 13-inch. And then the last difference in terms of optionality when you do buy this directly from Apple, you actually standard get the 35-watt dual charger, so the dual USB-C charger, which is something that you actually had to pay for additionally with the M2 13-inch MacBook Air. But they also offer a switch, so you're able to get the 70-watt charger with a single USB-C cable directly from Apple at no additional cost, which again would have been an upgrade from the M2 13-inch MacBook Air. So let's quickly talk about the good that I like about this M2 MacBook Air. So firstly, obviously, it's the size. The 15-inch size is something that we've wanted from a MacBook Air in a thin and light, in a portable laptop, and something that wasn't super overpowered. Like, I'm not somebody that's editing anything really on this MacBook Air, and not everybody is a content creator. So having a option at 15 inches that makes sure you don't get to that $2,000, $2,500 plus price point is great to have in the Apple lineup. So from a use case perspective, you get more screen real estate. So you can see from some of these side-by-sides that you are able to see more of an article when you are reading it. You're able to see bigger video, obviously. You're able to see more of a website compared to the 13-inch version because there just are more pixels to play with overall. Another amazing thing about especially just M series Apple computers anyway is this M2 15-inch MacBook Air has amazing battery life. The 13-inch MacBook Air was quoted at 18 hours, and even though this is a bigger laptop, which means bigger battery, that means bigger power draw, that means a bigger screen, we still get that 18 hours of battery life. And I've been testing it nonstop, and yes, I don't get to that full 18 hours of battery life, but I get pretty close. I get to 15, 16, and I bet you if I just stuck with Safari, if I just stuck with stuff like iMovie, if I just stuck with Pages and Apple iWork, and I stuck with just the Apple ecosystem, I would get those 18 hours. It's just I like to use Chrome on my laptop, I like to use third-party applications. You know, once you start leaving the Apple ecosystem, things start to be a little less optimized, but when Apple optimizes something, you get that full 18 hours of battery life on a big 15-inch laptop, which is pretty much unheard of in this space currently. And then again, the build quality, the portability, this form factor overall, it's just a really great addition to the Apple lineup, especially when you look at the pricing at $1299 is a great price because last year, or even just a couple months ago, the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air was at that same $1299 price point. So now the 15-inch MacBook Air replaces it at that price point, and then the actual M2 MacBook Air, the 13-inch version, is now $1099, which in its own right is a bargain. And then another thing to take note of when it comes to these laptops, or this 15-inch laptop, is that it does look a little funky because normally when you have those 14-inch, the 16-inch, or even those legacy 15-inch laptops that Apple used to make, the speaker grill was actually on the sides of the keyboard. So with this 15-inch MacBook Air, the speaker grills aren't there, so it looks a little bit weird if you're not used to it, because I've always looked at those laptops and seen that there, but now it's actually in the hinge of the laptop itself. Still gets plenty loud like we saw earlier or we heard earlier, but that is something to take note of. And then also, because we do have that 15-inch form factor and all that to play with in terms of a footprint, they made the trackpad decently larger compared to the 13-inch MacBook Air. So you can see that the trackpad gives you a lot more screen real estate, which from a functionality standpoint, sure, it's nice-ish, but it's not like the end of the world or a great upgrade. Like I wouldn't go spend more money just to get a little bit bigger of a trackpad because you can always speed up the trackpad speed on your 13-inch MacBook Air. But it is nice that it is a bigger footprint. And then lastly, when it comes to the good of these actual laptops, I want to put to bed that the baseline model M2 MacBook Air, the SSD situation. A lot of people have said, and it is true, that the SSD situation on the baseline model of both the 13 and the 15-inch MacBook Air is a little bit of a slower SSD compared to the 512 or even compared to the M1 MacBook Air. And that's because they split up the SSDs into two 128 SSDs, I believe, and that slows down the transfer speeds. For day-to-day use and for the consumer that Apple's aiming this 15-inch MacBook Air for, it's not going to matter. So whatever you want to say in the comments below, go for it and say it, but it's not going to matter. People aren't rendering stuff in 3D in real time all the time on these 15-inch MacBook Airs. If you need to do that, go to the Pro model. The baseline SSD is plenty fast enough for you to be able to transfer Word files, Google Docs, for you to be able to transfer a song or transfer a small video over from an SSD to an external SSD. So don't worry about the SSD speeds. They are a tiny bit slower, but day to day, you're not going to notice much. And now I do want to talk about what everybody's probably wondering is the bad of this laptop, because like I said, it's great build quality. The screen is great. There really isn't much to complain about. But the one thing I do want to complain about is the baseline spec and the limitations that it gives you. At that $1299 price point, you're getting 8 gigs of RAM. And now we're in 2023, 8 gigs of RAM, even though it's amazingly optimized on the M2 chip, it's still sometimes not enough. Yes, if you're just using iMessage or using Safari, or using smaller applications like Slack or Microsoft Teams, doing the occasional video chat, then it's fine. But once you start opening like 30, 40, 50, 100 Chrome tabs, which I know a lot of people do, and you know who you are, a lot of people love to leave their Chrome tabs open, it starts to slow down, and you start to get, especially when I use my MacPaw little tool, it starts to tell me like, hey, you want to clear some of your RAM because you're pretty close, you're at like 7.58, in terms of your RAM being used, and it's slowing down your computer. So 8 gigs of RAM, I just wish it was at that 16 gigs of RAM for the baseline model, because then you would be a little bit more future-proof. The 8 gigs of RAM is pretty restrictive on a laptop that is $1,300 in 2023, because once you, let's say you do want to, edit the occasional iMovie in 4K, right? It's doable, but it's relatively slow, and you have to make sure that you only have that open, because once you open up a bunch of Chrome tabs, you have something else playing in the background, you have your Slack open in real time, you have your Discord open, and then you're also editing an iMovie. it's going to kind of be choppy. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be fluid. If you're only using iMovie, then it'll be fine for the most part. But again, just from a multitasking standpoint, those 8 gigs of RAM sometimes slow you down when you're trying to get a lot done, especially, you're getting a 15-inch version because you want to be able to get more on that screen, more done at the same time. So I wish Apple upgraded it. And then the conundrum starts, right? So if you want to upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM, you're spending an extra $200. So now you're at $14.99. Most people, if they upgrade their RAM, they're going to want to upgrade their storage. Another $200 to get to 512. Now you're at $16.99. So now, do you spend the extra $300 to get the M2 Pro MacBook Pro at the 14-inch version because it is a lot faster, you get an extra Thunderbolt port, you get louder speakers, you get the mini LED display, and at that point, that $300 sale is probably worth it for those things that you're adding onto it. So again, you go into that kind of Apple scale. This is what Apple does amazingly, right? They price things relatively low. Like you can get the $1,000 M1 MacBook Air, but if you want a little bit more, why not get the M2? If you want a little bit more, why not get the 15-inch M2? If you need a little bit more, why not get the M2 Pro baseline model? And then so on and so forth. And now you see yourself, at the checkout screen with a $6,000 16-inch M2 Max MacBook Pro ready for checkout because you just thought you needed just that much more. But that is my gripe with Apple when it comes to this laptop. I wish the baseline model would have been 16 gigs and 512 gigs of storage, maybe even had it at $13.99 with those baseline specs, then it would be doable. That would be justifiable. But at 8 gigs of RAM with only 256 gigs of storage, I want to recommend people because people buy these laptops and they use it for 4 to 5 years. These aren't laptops that get changed every single year. It's $1,300. So getting something that is a little bit higher is what I always recommend. If I'm going to recommend one upgrade, is upgrade the RAM to 16 gigs because you can always get external storage, but that is just my 2 cents with what I think needs to be improved with Apple's lineup just overall, especially with this 15-inch MacBook Air. But that is just about going to do it for this video. Overall, I think the laptop is great. You will not be disappointed if you do buy it. But again, it's just that negative of the baseline model just needing a little bit more for the price, right? Because for $1,300, you can go out and get a Windows Intel laptop and get a little bit more on paper. Maybe not from a function standpoint, obviously, because the M2 chip is amazing, but on paper, you get a lot more for that same price point. So hopefully Apple kind of hears reviews, hears what everybody's saying, and kind of at least maybe next year upgrades everything to 512 and 16 gigs, because in 2024, we can't be still using 8 gigs of RAM, but that's just my 2 cents, everybody. If you did make it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And let me know in the comments down below, did you pick one of these up? What is your opinion on the 15-inch MacBook Air? Are you going to use it as a day-to-day? Is it your day-to-day? Are you happy with the purchase? Do you want one if you haven't gotten it yet? And where are you coming from? All questions that I would love to kind of discuss in the comments down below. But that is going to do it for this video. If you want to watch some more macOS, iOS, or iPadOS content, click on one of these videos right here. But until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm out of here, everybody. Peace.